December 15th, 12 years earlier. The icy wind cut through Sarah's designer coat like broken glass, each gust a cruel reminder that even nature seemed to conspire against her. She gripped the bridge's railing with white knuckles, the rusted metal biting through her expensive leather gloves. Below, the dark water of the Columbia River beckoned with deceptive tranquility, promising an end to the agony that had consumed her every waking moment since the scandal broke. 28 years old and already finished. The thought echoed in her mind like a death knell. Her career was over. The accusations, meticulously crafted lies that felt more convincing than her protestations of innocence, had obliterated everything she'd spent a decade building. The Sarah Montgomery Show was canceled after emergency network meetings. Her fiancé, David, had packed his belongings while she was at her lawyer's office, leaving only a note about protecting his reputation. The media circus had transformed her from America's sweetheart into a pariah overnight. The bottle of pills in her coat pocket seemed to pulse with its own weight, heavier than the shame crushing her chest. 30 Percocet, left over from her wisdom tooth surgery. The irony wasn't lost on her. She'd saved them for severe pain, never imagining anything could hurt worse than dental work. The past 3 weeks had blurred into a nightmare of depositions, reporters camping outside her apartment, and the systematic destruction of her character. Her own producer, Martin, the man who discovered her at a college journalism fair, had been the final betrayal. He presented doctored emails to the network executives, painting her as an unstable diva who'd fabricated stories for ratings. The woman who had once interviewed presidents and Nobel Prize winners now couldn't get hired at a community access station. Her agent had stopped returning calls. Her friends had evaporated like morning mist. Sarah closed her eyes, feeling the December cold seep into her bones with numbing finality. This was supposed to be her breakthrough year. The network had been discussing a prime-time slot, national syndication, maybe even a morning show deal. Instead, she'd become another cautionary tale about the fickle nature of fame and the swift, merciless justice of public opinion. The pills rattled softly as she shifted her weight against the railing. Beautiful night, isn't it? The voice emerged from the darkness like a gentle interruption to her final moments. Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs as she turned, expecting to see a police officer or security guard ready to drag her away from her chosen end. Instead, she found a man in his 50s approaching with deliberate slowness, his weathered hands held visible and unthreatening. His clothes were worn but surprisingly clean, a faded denim jacket over a gray sweater, work boots that had seen better decades. What struck her most were his eyes, brown and kind, holding a gentleness that seemed impossibly out of place in her current world of betrayal and calculated cruelty. "Please don't," she whispered, tears freezing into tiny crystals on her cheeks. "Just please let me go." "Can't do that, miss." He settled against the railing beside her, maintaining respectful distance while positioning himself close enough that she could smell coffee on his breath and see the deep concern etched in the weathered lines around his eyes. "Name's Marcus. What's yours?" The absurdity almost made her laugh, would have, if she possessed any laughter left. Here she was, Sarah Montgomery, whose face had been plastered across every tabloid and news program for weeks, and this homeless man gazed at her with complete, blissful ignorance of her notoriety. "Sarah," she managed, her voice barely audible above the wind. "Well, Sarah, I've been living rough for about 3 years now, ever since my Jennifer died." His voice carried the steady, conversational tone of someone discussing the weather rather than personal tragedy. "Cancer took her. Took our house too with all the medical bills. Lost my job at the plant afterward. Couldn't keep up with much of anything. You know what I learned, though?" She shook her head, finding herself inexplicably mesmerized by his calm presence. "Rock bottom's got a real solid foundation. Once you're there, ain't nowhere to go but up." He shifted slightly, and she heard the soft clink of metal against metal from his backpack. Marcus reached into his backpack with practiced efficiency, withdrawing a battered thermos that had clearly seen countless nights like this one. The metal was dented and scratched, but when he unscrewed the cap, the rich aroma of coffee escaped into the frigid air like a small miracle. Coffee? Still warm. The gesture was so simple, so fundamentally human, that it cracked something deep inside Sarah's chest, something that had been frozen solid since Martin's betrayal 3 weeks ago. She found herself accepting the offered cup, her numb fingers wrapping around the warm metal as sensation slowly returned to her extremities. It was just instant coffee, probably the cheapest brand available, but it tasted like salvation. The warmth spread through her body, and for the first time in weeks, she felt almost human again. "You don't know who I am, do you?" she asked, testing the waters of his ignorance like a lifeline. Should I? Marcus's eyes held genuine curiosity, not the calculating gleam she'd grown accustomed to from reporters, lawyers, and former friends. I'm Sarah Montgomery. I had a talk show, had being the operative word. The words tumbled out before she could stop them, carrying with them the entire sordid story. The false accusations of fabricating interviews, the doctored emails that made her look unstable and unethical, the complete media circus that had devoured her reputation like a ravenous beast. Marcus listened without judgment, occasionally nodding as she poured out her pain. They talked through the endless December night, their words creating small clouds of vapor that dissipated into the darkness. Marcus shared stories of his Jennifer, how they'd met at a church potluck 30 years ago, her laugh that could fill a room, the way she'd hummed while doing crossword puzzles during her chemotherapy treatments. He spoke of their dreams with the tenderness of someone who understood that hopes could be precious even when unfulfilled. They'd planned to travel after his retirement, maybe see the Grand Canyon, visit Jennifer's sister in Maine. Instead, they'd spent their savings on experimental treatments that bought only 6 more months and deeper debt. The shelter volunteers at St. Mary's treat us like people, Marcus continued, his voice carrying genuine gratitude. Not like problems to be solved or statistics to be managed. There's this one lady, comes every Tuesday with homemade soup, never asks our names, never preaches, just serves and smiles. Sarah found herself genuinely interested in these stories of small kindnesses, these glimpses into a world she'd never considered. As dawn began painting the eastern horizon in delicate shades of pink and gold, she felt something she hadn't experienced in months. Not the artificial calm of wine or sleeping pills, but genuine peace. Fame's a funny thing, Marcus observed as they watched the sunrise transform the river from black to silver. Makes folks think they know you, but they don't know your heart. All they see is what the cameras show them, what the newspapers tell them to think. He turned those kind eyes toward her again, and Sarah felt truly seen for the first time in years. I may not have much, but I can see your heart, Sarah. It's good. It's been hurt real bad, but it's good. Don't let them take that from you. When the police finally arrived, summoned by an early morning jogger who'd spotted them on the bridge, Sarah was sitting on a nearby bench with Marcus, no longer balanced on the wrong side of the railing. She gave him her business card before the officers gently escorted her to the hospital for mandatory evaluation. When I get back on my feet, she promised, pressing the card into his weathered palm, I'm going to find you. 1 week later, Sarah returned to the bridge carrying a bag of groceries and a new thermos filled with premium coffee. Her 72-hour psychiatric hold had ended with a clean bill of mental health, though the dark circles under her eyes told a different story. The pills now sat at the bottom of the Columbia River, thrown from this very spot the morning she'd been released. But Marcus was gone. She waited for hours, asking every person who passed if they'd seen a kind-faced man in his 50s with graying hair and gentle eyes. Most hurried past without acknowledgement, but a few joggers and dog walkers remembered him vaguely. He was here sometimes. One elderly woman offered. Always polite, always said good morning. The shelter volunteers at St. Mary's knew Marcus well, but delivered crushing news. He moved on, as homeless folks often did. Never stayed anywhere too long, explained Sister Catherine, a nun who'd been serving meals for 15 years. Some of them are like that, afraid of getting too comfortable, maybe afraid of being a burden. Sarah hired 3 different private investigators over the next 8 months. They followed leads through Portland's network of shelters, soup kitchens, and social services. One thought he'd spotted Marcus at a mission in Seattle. Another traced a Marcus Chun to a rehabilitation program in Sacramento, but it turned out to be someone 30 years younger. Her therapist, Dr. Reyes, suggested she was projecting her need for purpose onto an impossible quest. You're trying to save Marcus because you couldn't save yourself that night, she observed during one of their sessions. But you did save yourself, Sarah. You chose to live. But Sarah knew better. Marcus had saved her first, and the debt felt unpayable until she could find him again. Slowly, painfully, she began rebuilding her life. Riverdale Community College offered her a position teaching media studies. Not glamorous work, but honest employment. She started volunteering at homeless shelters during her free time, always scanning faces, always hoping to glimpse those familiar kind eyes in the crowd of forgotten souls, seeking warmth and a hot meal. Every night, she kept Marcus's business card on her nightstand, the edges growing soft from handling, a talisman of the man who taught her that rock bottom could indeed be a foundation. 3 years after the bridge, Sarah's legal vindication arrived with a whimper rather than fanfare. A disgruntled employee at the network leaked the original, unaltered emails, proving Martin's doctoring. The lawsuit settlement was substantial, enough to never work again if she chose, but the victory felt hollow. Her name was cleared, but her old life remained irretrievably lost. Standing in her lawyer's office, holding a check for $2.3 million, Sarah thought of Marcus's words about rock bottom being a solid foundation. She climbed up from that foundation, but not in the direction anyone expected. The Sarah Montgomery Foundation launched quietly from a rented office above a used bookstore downtown. If she couldn't find Marcus, she could at least help people like him. The foundation's mission was simple: provide housing assistance, job training, and mental health services to Portland's homeless population, treating each person with the dignity Marcus had shown her. Why this cause? Reporters asked her in the foundation's modest press conference. Because sometimes the people who save us don't look like heroes, Sarah replied, thinking of a man with kind eyes and a thermos of coffee. They look like hope in a worn coat, carrying wisdom earned through suffering. The foundation grew slowly but steadily. Sarah poured her energy into it with the fervor of someone making amends for a debt that could never be fully repaid. She worked 18-hour days, personally interviewing clients, following up on success stories, learning the complex web of factors that led people to streets. She met Vietnam veterans haunted by memories, single mothers fleeing abusive relationships, college graduates crushed by medical debt. Each story added another layer to her understanding of how quickly anyone could fall through society's cracks. At night, she would sit in her small apartment. She downgraded dramatically from her former penthouse and write thank you notes to Marcus in a journal she'd never send. She told him about James, the former teacher who now managed a downtown shelter, about Maria, who had gone from sleeping in her car to becoming a nurse, about the hundreds of small victories his single act of kindness had made possible. The foundation's first shelter opened 18 months later, with a small plaque by the entrance, in memory of those who remind us that rock bottom has a solid foundation. 5 years after the bridge incident, the phone call came on a rainy Tuesday morning. Sarah was reviewing grant applications in her foundation office when her assistant knocked tentatively on the door. "There's someone from KTU on line 2, Jennifer said, her voice uncertain. "They want to offer you a television opportunity." Sarah's stomach clenched. She'd turned down dozens of similar calls over the years. Reality show producers wanted to exploit her comeback story. Cable networks offering late-night slots for desperate former celebrities. She'd assumed her television career was permanently buried under the scandal's debris. But this was different. The network wanted to give her a genuine second chance. A late-night talk show focused on human interest stories, local heroes, and community builders. It was far from her old prime-time slot, but it represented something more valuable: redemption. The Sarah Montgomery Hour premiered 6 months later to modest ratings but unexpected critical acclaim. Sarah had changed fundamentally. Gone was the polished interviewer chasing celebrity scoops and sensational headlines. In her place sat someone who understood suffering, who could draw out authentic stories from people society typically ignored. Her first week featured a janitor who'd started a literacy program, a retired librarian teaching computer skills to seniors, and a group of teenagers who transformed an abandoned lot into a community garden. These weren't glamorous subjects, but Sarah's interviews revealed the extraordinary within the ordinary. One night, she interviewed Marcus Williams, a former homeless veteran who became a successful contractor after getting help from various local programs, including her own foundation. As he spoke about the volunteers and social workers who believe in him, Sarah felt that familiar ache in her chest. "Whoever saved you first," Marcus Williams said, not knowing the parallel story, "I hope they know what they started. Your foundation changed my life, but somebody must have changed yours first." Sarah smiled through her tears, thinking of another Marcus whose last name she'd never learned. "I hope he knows, too," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the studio's gentle hum. The show's ratings grew steadily, built on authentic connections rather than manufactured drama. Sarah had found her calling, not in entertaining the masses, but in illuminating the quiet heroes who made communities stronger, one small act at a time. By the 10th anniversary of her near suicide, Sarah had become something she'd never expected: a media mogul built on compassion rather than sensationalism. The Sarah Montgomery Hour was syndicated in 43 markets across the country, reaching millions of viewers hungry for authentic human connection in an increasingly artificial world. Her foundation had expanded beyond her wildest dreams. The Montgomery House shelters operated in 12 cities, providing not just temporary housing, but comprehensive support systems, job training programs, mental health services, addiction counseling, and educational opportunities. Each facility designed to treat residents as human beings deserving of dignity, not charity cases to be managed. Sarah had never married, despite several meaningful relationships over the years. The men she dated struggled to understand her dedication to her work, her need to personally visit every shelter, her insistence on knowing the names and stories of hundreds of residents. They couldn't grasp that she wasn't trying to save the world. She was trying to repay a debt to a man who'd saved hers. Her penthouse apartment overlooked the Columbia River, close enough to see the bridge where everything had changed. She kept a telescope on her balcony, sometimes scanning the riverbank at dawn, still hoping to glimpse a familiar figure with kind eyes and a worn coat. Each Montgomery House shelter bore the same small bronze plaque by its entrance, in memory of those who remind us that rock bottom has a solid foundation. Residents often asked about the inscription's origin, but Sarah would only smile and say it came from someone who taught her that wisdom often comes from unexpected teachers. The Foundation's annual report showed staggering success rates. 67% of residents secured permanent housing within 6 months, 43% found stable employment, and 81% reported improved mental health outcomes. But Sarah measured success differently. In the letters she received from former residents, in the photographs of families reunited, in the ripple effects of hope spreading through communities. Late at night, she still wrote in her journal to Marcus, updating him on lives transformed by the kindness he'd started. She told him about Rebecca, who'd gone from sleeping in her car to becoming a nurse practitioner, about David, who'd beaten addiction and now counseled others, about the thousands of faces that represented his legacy, though he'd never know it. On a cold Tuesday morning in March, Marcus Chin sat in the sterile examination room of the free clinic attached to the Montgomery House on 5th Street, staring at the X-ray illuminated on the wall. The dark masses in his lungs looked like storm clouds against the white background of his ribs. Dr. Patricia Nguyen had delivered the news with practiced gentleness, but the words still hit him like physical blows. Advanced lung cancer. Stage 4. Maybe a month. Possibly 2 if you're fortunate. Marcus had been living at the Montgomery House for 6 months, ever since his persistent cough and increasing fatigue had made it impossible to maintain his previous transient lifestyle. The shelter was different from the dozens of others he'd stayed in over the years. Cleaner, more dignified, with counselors who actually seemed to care about the residents rather than just managing them. The staff treated him like a person, not a problem to be solved. They knew his name, asked about his day, remembered that he preferred his coffee black, and took sugar in his tea. Small kindnesses that made the difference between existing and living. It wasn't until today, sitting in the doctor's office with death knocking at his door, that someone had mentioned the shelter's founder, Sarah Montgomery. Dr. Nguyen had said when Marcus complimented the facility's compassionate approach. She started this place after her own difficult period. Real success story, that woman. The name had hit Marcus like an electric shock. Sarah Montgomery. The same Sarah whose business card he carried for 12 years, moving it from wallet to wallet, shelter to shelter, through rain and snow and countless lonely nights. He kept track of her career resurrection from afar, catching glimpses of her television show in shelter common rooms, reading about her foundation's work in discarded newspapers. He'd felt proud watching her rebuild her life, but he'd never wanted to complicate her success by reappearing as a reminder of her darkest moment. Now, facing his own mortality in a facility bearing her name, Marcus felt profound irony settling over him. He'd spent his final months in a place built from the very hope he'd tried to instill in her that December night 12 years ago. The circle was nearly complete, but Sarah would never know. That evening, Marcus sat in the shelter's common room, watching Sarah's show on the old television mounted in the corner. She was interviewing a woman who'd started a literacy program for underprivileged children, and Sarah's eyes sparkled with the same genuine interest he remembered from that December night so long ago. She looked good, older certainly, with silver threading through her dark hair, but more grounded than the desperate woman he'd met on the bridge. Her success clearly hadn't corrupted her spirit. If anything, it had refined her compassion into something powerful and purposeful. "That's our founder," said Tommy Rodriguez, a younger resident who'd been at the shelter for a few weeks. He was maybe 30, with the weathered look of someone who'd aged quickly on the streets. Met her once when she came to visit. Real class act, you know? Talks to everybody like they matter. Marcus nodded, not trusting his voice. He'd pulled out Sarah's business card earlier, the edges now soft as fabric from years of handling. The ink had faded, but he could still make out her name and the old phone number that probably hadn't worked for a decade. "You know," Tommy continued, settling into the adjacent chair, "she's going to be at some big awards show next week. presenting, or something. I heard the staff talking about it. They're all excited to watch her on TV. Marcus's pulse quickened. The entertainment awards. He'd seen the advertisements during commercial breaks. It would be broadcast live from Los Angeles, watched by millions around the world. If he could somehow get there, somehow see her face one more time, maybe tell her what her kindness had meant. But how could a dying homeless man get into the most exclusive event in Hollywood? He had no money, no connections, no plan beyond a desperate need to complete a circle that had been 12 years in the making. That night, Marcus lay on his narrow cot, staring at the ceiling tiles and formulating an impossible scheme. He had perhaps 3 weeks before his condition would deteriorate too much for travel. 3 weeks to find a way to Los Angeles, to somehow breach the security of the Dolby Theater, to reach the woman whose life he'd saved so that she could save thousands of others. It was crazy. But Marcus had learned that sometimes crazy was just another word for determined. Marcus spent the next week planning with the methodical precision of someone who had nothing left to lose. He used the shelter's computer during allocated time slots, researching the Dolby Theater's layout, studying security protocols, memorizing every entrance and exit. The cancer made him tired easily, but desperation fueled his determination. He pawned his few remaining possessions at a shop 3 blocks away, Jennifer's wedding ring, which he'd somehow managed to keep through years of homelessness, and his father's pocket watch, a gift from his own wedding day. The combined total barely covered a Greyhound bus ticket to Los Angeles and a threadbare suit from a nearby Goodwill store. The night before the awards show, Marcus sat on his cot in the shelter, staring at Sarah's business card by the light of his small bedside lamp. 12 years old now, the cardstock soft as cloth from constant handling. He'd carried it through rain and snow, through nights in doorways and days in soup kitchens, through the slow dissolution of his old life and the gradual acceptance of his new reality. "You leaving, Marcus?" Tommy asked, noticing the small duffel bag packed beside his bed. "Got some business to take care of," Marcus replied, tucking the precious card into his wallet. "Don't suppose I'll be back." Tommy nodded with the understanding that came from living on society's margins. In the homeless community, people disappeared regularly. Sometimes they got back on their feet and moved into permanent housing. Sometimes they moved on to other cities, other shelters, and sometimes they simply faded away. "You take care of yourself, old man. And hey," Tommy hesitated, then continued, "this place, the Montgomery House, you remember what it stands for. People helping people, treating each other with dignity. That's all any of us can really do, right?" Marcus smiled, touched by the young man's wisdom. "You're right, Tommy. That's exactly what it's about." The next morning, Marcus boarded the Greyhound bus to Los Angeles, carrying nothing but his worn suit, Sarah's faded business card, and a thermos filled with coffee from the shelter's kitchen. Some habits, he reflected as the bus pulled away from Portland, were worth keeping until the very end. As the Pacific Northwest landscape rolled past his window, Marcus felt something he hadn't experienced in years. Purpose. He was going to see Sarah one more time, and maybe, just maybe, he could tell her what her life had become because of that night on #The Savior in the spotlight. The crystal chandelier swayed ominously overhead as Marcus stumbled through the gilded doors of the Dolby Theater, his weathered hands leaving smudges on the pristine glass. Security guards lunged toward him, their black suits a stark contrast to his torn flannel shirt and mudcake boots. But he pushed forward with desperate urgency. "Wait!" he gasped, his voice cracking as he spotted the woman in the shimmering gold gown on stage. Sarah, please." The 67th Annual Entertainment Awards ceremony ground to a halt. 3,000 of Hollywood's elite turned in their velvet seats, their diamonds catching the stage lights as they stared at the disheveled intruder. Cameras swiveled, broadcasting his wild eyes and unkempt beard to millions of viewers worldwide. On stage, Sarah Montgomery, America's beloved talk show host and tonight's presenter, froze mid-sentence, the golden envelope trembling in her manicured hands. Her teleprompter displayed the next winner's name, but the words blurred as she stared at the man security was now restraining in the aisle. "My God," she whispered, but her lapel microphone caught every syllable, amplified across the stunned auditorium. The sound system crackled with feedback as she dropped the envelope, its metallic flutter echoing in the sudden silence. Marcus struggled against the guard's grip, his desperate gaze locked on hers. "You have to remember," he pleaded, his voice breaking. "The bridge, Sarah. December 15th. You have to remember." Sarah's hand flew to her throat, her fingers finding the thin silver scar that makeup had concealed for 12 years. The world seemed to tilt as recognition dawned, and suddenly she was no longer the polished celebrity standing before millions. She was a broken 28-year-old woman standing on the edge of the Riverside Bridge on the coldest night of her life. Now, standing in the Dolby Theater with security guards flanking him, Marcus felt every one of his 67 years. The cancer had weakened him more than he'd admitted to the doctors, and the adrenaline of getting inside was wearing off. "Security, stop!" Sarah's voice rang out across the theater, cutting to the murmur of confused voices. "Let him go, please." The guards hesitated, looking between their struggling captive and the woman, whose word carried weight in this glittering world. Slowly, they released Marcus, who stumbled forward, his eyes never leaving Sarah's face. She descended from the stage, her designer gown trailing behind her as she moved through the stunned audience. Cameras tracked her every step, broadcast satellites carrying the moment to living rooms around the globe, but she only had eyes for the man who'd save her life. "I never stopped looking for you," she whispered as she reached him, her voice barely audible but picked up by the sensitive microphones. "I kept my promise, Marcus. The Sarah Montgomery Foundation, we've helped over 10,000 homeless individuals find housing and jobs. But I couldn't find you." Marcus's weathered face crumpled, tears cutting tracks through the grime on his cheeks. "I heard about your foundation. Saw you on TV, all successful again. I was proud, but I didn't want to intrude. Figured you'd moved on." Sarah reached out, her hands finding his callous ones, not care about the dirt or the cameras or the audience of millions. "You didn't intrude tonight. Why now?" "Lung cancer," he said simply. "Doc says I got maybe a month. I've been living in the shelter over on 5th Street, the Montgomery House, they call it. Didn't even know it was yours till someone mentioned it yesterday. I want to see you one more time. Tell you how proud I am of what you became." The silence in the theater was absolute. 3,000 people held their breath as Sarah's composure finally broke, tears streaming down her face, carrying her makeup with them. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said, turning to address the audience and cameras, her voice strengthening with each word, "this is Marcus Chun. 12 years ago, when I was at the lowest point of my life, when I had lost everything and saw no way forward, this man saved me, not with grand gestures or motivational speeches, but with a cup of coffee and the simple reminder that rock bottom has a solid foundation." She turned back to Marcus, her hand still holding his. "You said you're at the Montgomery House?" He nodded, confusion flickering in his eyes. "Then you're coming home with me tonight. We have a lot of catching up to do, and I have 12 years of gratitude to show you." The standing ovation began slowly, one person in the front row rising to their feet, then another, until the entire theater thundered with applause. But Sarah didn't hear it. She was too busy embracing the man who'd taught her that sometimes salvation comes in the most unexpected packages, from most unlikely saviors. As the cameras captured their reunion, broadcasting it to a world hungry for authentic human connection, Sarah whispered in Marcus's ear, "Thank you for finding me again, both times." Marcus smiled, his arm around the woman whose life he'd saved without ever knowing the magnitude of that gift. "Told you rock bottom's got a solid foundation, Sarah. Look how high you climbed." The award show continued, but for the millions watching, the real prize had already been given, a reminder that in a world often cold and disconnected, kindness from a stranger can change everything, and the people who save us don't always look like heroes. Sometimes they look like hope wearing a worn flannel shirt, carrying a thermos of coffee and the wisdom that comes from surviving the fall. In the weeks that followed, Marcus would spend his remaining days not in a sterile hospital room, but in the guest suite of Sarah's home, surrounded by photo albums of the lives the Montgomery Foundation had changed, knowing that his own act of compassion had rippled outward to touch thousands. And when he passed peacefully in his sleep on a Tuesday morning in spring, Sarah was holding his hand, whispering the same words he'd once spoken to her on a bridge. "Thank you for showing me that rock bottom has a solid foundation. Thank you for teaching me how to climb." The foundation planted a garden in Marcus's memory behind the original Montgomery House, with a simple stone bench and a plaque that read, "For Marcus Chun, who reminded us that a cup of coffee and a kind word can save a life." Every year on December 15th, Sarah would sit on that bench and remember the night a stranger became her savior, and how that salvation had grown into something beautiful that would outlast them both.